I'm blurry again. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another week of live commentary. Actually, we're going to complete the latest paper we were talking about. It's been a very odd day. I actually haven't eaten, so I had to get my tea because it was like, I need my tea. And it's just been a crazy little day. It's been a crazy little day. I had to go into Turin, and there is so much construction going on all over the place that it took me like almost 30 minutes more than it normally takes me to get into Turin for an appointment. So when I came back, it was like everything was just delayed, everything. But that's okay because, it's Friday. And I'm really looking forward, although my weekend is packed already, but I'm really looking forward to it. It's going to be emotional and it's going to have lots of different things that are going on. So it's going to be great. But that is not what we're here for. We're here to complete our paper on phytomorphizing performance, which we started last week. Do you remember this paper? Don't worry. I'll fill you in. I'll share it so you can see the screen. By the way, before I share that screen, by the way, I did an experiment this week. I went live just randomly to do a conference. So this is a conference that I had signed up for around plant sentience, actually forest sentience. And I had hoped to do it live, like to do commentary as it was happening live, but I realized that it's really hard to do it on a YouTube live, on a Zoom live, because you can't stop and like come back and see things and whatever. So I waited till I got the YouTube recording, which I had the permission of the conference authors, and I ended up doing a live on that. It was a test run, so that's why I published it inside of the Naturally Conscious community. If you're watching here on YouTube, then you haven't seen it yet, and I'm not probably going to publish it because it was all a test, and so the very beginning of it is a little bit choppy and stuff like that. But the good part is that it worked. It was very cool. And I actually have about 4 other conferences that I had been wanting to see. There were ones that people have sent me the replays for. There's some really cool subject matter in. So in addition to these live reviews of the papers, I think I'm going to add this commentary also on conferences. So we're going to test it out. We're going to see how it goes. And I'd love your feedback. Let me know in the comments if you like it or you don't like it. I'm still relatively new at this. I've done a lot of the papers, so the whole formatting of like giving you chapters and stuff like that, I don't know how to do any of that yet. I'm getting there. So, but I am excited. So you have the YouTube, like the 2 long form content is the podcast, as well as then this live commentary. Those are the 2 that you can see things across multiple different platforms, including the Naturally Conscious community and YouTube and my website and stuff like that. And I also have a bunch of shorts. There's really content all over the place. And I would love your feedback on it. It helps me to understand what you're most interested in, especially if there are conferences or papers coming up that you want me to review. Please let me know. The more feedback I get from you, the easier it is to create this content. Also, share this with your friends. Like wherever it is that you're watching, hit the little like button, even if it's inside the Naturally Conscious community, so we know that you've seen it. Let me know what your thoughts are on it. Put some comments in there because that really helps me to organize. As you know, I have a running order of all of these different papers that I'm going through, but it always kind of helps to know what you think. All right, so let me give you a little bit of where we are and what the heck we're going to be talking about today. So this was a paper that I found that turned out to be super interesting so far, called Phytomorphizing Performance, Plant Performance in an Expanded Field. So it's really about the world of performance art and how the difficulty in performance art from the perspective of just getting animal participation, that's not the right word. Let me think about it this way, in a different way. So basically, performance is considered to be something that has action, right? You have actors and action. So therefore, performance has expanded to include, for example, animals. And although it's still a somewhat tricky subject, according to this paper, it is something that is becoming much more commonplace. But where is the place for phytomorphism, like for the photosynthetic ones, as I like now that this is a terminology that I've enjoyed, which is, plants and all these other types of beings? Where is it that they could enter into the performance space? And the first part of this that we went through the first half, was really about stating some of the major objections. So explaining the history of performance art, how animal performance art became, or how animals became part of the performance world. And then from there, what are some of the major objections that people would have to including plants as part of performers? That doesn't mean including plants in the performance. I think including plants as part of the performance, we have always seen as backdrop, as scenery, as all these other things. But instead, to change the entire ontology to the idea that plants would be agents, actors in the performance, is something that is completely new and different. So therefore, we're going to get into seeing and we understand what makes sense there. So we went through there. My advice is to go see part 1, obviously, if you haven't watched it, because it's going to give you the base. But really, part 1 just identified what were some of the major kind of pitfalls, explaining what performance is, performance and activity, and the fact that performance is considered active as something. And therefore, when most people think about plants, incorrectly so, we don't think about the idea that plants are active agents, although he starts to already dispel this by talking about research from Galeano and the way that Michael Marder talks about plants and all these other aspects that we know pretty well here in the naturally conscious community. But he breaks them down very nicely for a non-plant sort of with it audience. And then he talks about the fact that action and intentionality is kind of what the hallmark of a performance is. And so this would be probably the biggest objections to the idea of including plants. So now we're going to get into, I believe this is where it is. Hold on, let me double check all of my notes. Oh no, actually I was wrong. We are, he went into, I was looking at that part. Okay, action intentionality is exactly where we're starting. So we talked up until now about what were some of the major objections, what were the ways that people historically have seen plants, and most likely in that reasoning, why they would not be included as active agents for performance, and why he doesn't believe that this is an actually valid argument anymore, given what we know. So Brisini, who is the name of the author. All right, so let's get into this, because I'm actually curious as to where it goes, and I'm really excited. I actually really like this paper. This is one of the things about doing this work, that, especially doing it with you, that I haven't enjoyed the most, is the fact that I didn't pull from, although we started with the whole concept of plant consciousness and of plant intelligence and of plant neurobiology, that was our scope when we first started. Once we passed the 2015, 2017 mark, we are now going to be continuously expanding, because with the birth of human-plant relations, with more and more discussions in the plant humanities and in the arts in general around plants, as we're talking about right now, right, active agents, the ontology is really changing, and it's giving a lot of space for this new way of describing things, and therefore plants as participant members. And so I'm really enjoying the idea of pulling from all kinds of different academia, all different parts of academia. So in order to give us a very broad view. Again, as I always say to you, if you have very specific things you would like me to look at, something to focus on, please feel free to send me a message, let me know about it and stuff, because there's probably even a lot more out there that I don't know about. I am connected in wherever I can connect, but there's a lot of things that I don't enter into. And just today, actually, somebody was asking me more about scientific type of understandings. Now, I have to admit that of course, when I'm talking about something like this, hold hold on, since I'm talking. When I talk about something like this in a paper like this, of course, I try as much as possible to break down the science for you. Some of these papers are really great at giving you a sort of really good description or a background or stuff like that. And sometimes some of these papers take certain things into, like, they just assume people understand. So that's why I'm here to help you break those down. That being said, I haven't really been focusing too much on the biology only, although we have done some really great papers around things like attention blinks, and which, if you don't know what it is, go look for the paper because the paper was fascinating. We have done some about volatile organic chemicals, which is one of the ways that plants signal. And so I do try to interject a little bit of the biology in there. It's always hard. It's always hard to try to balance and understand what level of biology is most important for you, because obviously I'm not a biologist, I'm not a plant biologist, I'm not a molecular biologist. I have studied enough to be able to give you pretty good descriptions of certain aspects of it, but there is a big wide space between understanding general mechanisms of plant signaling and how plants use, for example, volatile organic chemicals, or how plants use electrical responses, versus getting deep down into the plant cell. And I don't know if that's useful to you. I do bring it up as much as I can when we get into those topics, but I have a few papers that are extremely biological, but I feel like sometimes those get extremely dry, and I prefer, when possible, to find articles that summarize them in ways that maybe are more useful to us for our connection. If you're really looking for plant biology, my advice is go study plant biology. I mean, there's amazing things going on in plant biology. I prefer to stay more in the humanities with just the right touch of plant biology to help us understand what we're talking about. So, but again, I'm always open to whatever it is that you want to go through and what you think might be interesting conversation points. So feel free to just let me know what your thoughts are. Okay, so like I said, we are now at action and intentionality, the hallmarks of performance. Remember, we're talking about performance arts and what is the role of performance arts? What is the role of plants can play in performance arts? Now that we have a much better understanding of the fact that plants are sentient beings, let's just say it that way. Okay, skeptics may wonder whether this definition of action, so action intentionality, allows for an intentionality that is often perceived to be a hallmark of performance. As Pelias and Van Oosting note, performance studies have historically operated with an inclusionary impulse towards performers and audiences, and a non-canonical attitude towards text that treats all members of a speech community as potential artists, all utterances as potentially aesthetic, all events as potentially theatrical, and all audiences as potentially active participants who can authorize aesthetic experience. I really wonder if he's going to address. So I was recording an episode for the podcast with my good friend Tritone Crisantemo, which you're going to love. It was all about plant music and his work with Master Plant's Symphony and the creation of Master Plant Symphony, which is both a musical community as well as a device. But you'll see it all in the podcast. It's going to come out soon. And he and I had this big conversation about the evolution of plant music from jam session, where, you know, you allow plants to play and then humans also play, and it's more spontaneous and such, versus the idea of performance and recorded music, and how with plants who you don't exactly train and say, okay, play this progression of melody, how do you create a repeatable performance out of that? And so I'm really wondering if he's going to tap into this in this conversation, because I think that that's one of the, I mean, sure, improv is a thing, and I think plants can be very active agents in improv type settings. But is there another space that maybe develops? Is there a different form of communication that we're having with plants that allows for quote unquote scripted performance? I don't know. I think this will be an interesting place to see where he goes with this. Okay. The concept of intentionality, where am I? I'm here. The concept of intentionality has been one key appraisal for those who would attempt to delimit this broadened field and more strenuously police those actions and entities that may be dubbed performance. Macaulay, voicing his concern regarding the watering down of the term performance by the search for ever-broadening objects of studies, cites intentionality as his cites intentionality as his benchmark for determining whether something is or is not performance. My own rule of thumb has been that for an activity to be regarded as performance, it must involve the live presence of the performers and those witnessing it. And there must be some intentionality on the part of the performer or witness or both. And that these conditions in turn necessitate analysis of the place and temporality, which enables both parties to be present to each other, as well as what can be described as the performance contract between them, whether explicit or implicit. Okay, I like that. I mean, as a former performer, as somebody who has, it's really interesting. It's very interesting to see also in the theater, there's a nuance there between I perform, like for example, in a theater setting, I perform in a theater setting between my fellow actors, and it's kind of like almost like the audience is not engaged. The audience is a voyeur to what's happening. And at the same time, anybody who's ever been on a stage and performed knows that when the audience is empty, you feel it. It's different. A performance just isn't a performance without the audience there of some sort. Kind of like these live streams aren't really these live streams until somebody connects into them. While there is a strong argument to be made that intentionality vis-a-vis planning and foresight should not be considered the marker of freedom or sociality amongst other than human agents, it may prove to be an important consideration for appraising whether or not an interaction is a performance. More importantly, it may serve as an important consideration for convincing skeptics of the reality of plant performance. The question posed to meet this requirement is therefore simple. Do plants display intentionality in their behavior? And furthermore, does the intentionality seem to be directed towards performing actions? Trewavas is clear in his analysis of extant research that contemporary plant behaviorists are willing to grant plants a sense of intentionality in their behaviors. Hold on a second. Sorry about this. I actually have somebody who's ringing my door, and I just want to tell if it is. This is what happens when you do live things. Okay, so he summarizes a number of studies which document plants undertaking actions such as denying their competitor resources by altering the structures of their roots, yes, actively foraging for nutrients and necessary trace elements, and preemptively deploying volatile chemicals in an effort to dissuade herbivores from consuming them, among other behaviors. This intentionality does not necessarily presuppose a volitional will or a self-referential cognition, i.e. a human standard. Rather, Trewavas links it to an emergent intentionality of swarm behavior, wherein clusters of individuals or cells working in tandem at their own discrete tasks produce an emergent behavior matrix that is nonetheless intentionally achieving some end. I'm thinking on this because this is one of those places where somebody like Trewavas and also Michael Martyr sometimes, but really a lot of these folks walk a very fine line because they want to, this is my opinion only, okay? I feel like they are those that are already on the side of plants as conscious agents, but who are deeply in the academic world, know that you can't go from where we are to there in like 10 years, okay? It's just going to take a while. I think some of them are very strategic in the way that they describe things. Like, I'm outside of that world, so I can be, as true to what I believe the plants are today, to what plants are telling me today. I can be as true to that as I want, because my grant money doesn't come from anybody. I don't have tenure or worry about like being fired from an academic institution. I don't have to worry about being ostracized or any of these types of things. So I can push the envelope in a completely different way. I think some of these have to be very careful with the words that they speak, because they have to ensure that they are pushing the envelope, and they're already pretty controversial, to be honest, while still keeping a very strong foundation in the sciences, so as to be able to move people. So you move them along to where we are here, and then after a few years, when they become habituated to that, then we move them a little farther along, and eventually we will get where we need to go. You can't just do it in. So I think that this is a great example of Chihuahua's being very careful with the words, where it's like, we would just call this, conscious thought and behavior. And Chihuahua's is like, this is emergence. This is something that emerges based on a whole series of perspectives, right? We would say plant knows that herbivore is eating, and therefore plant chooses to move everything over here, while Chihuahua's has to say there's an intentionality in the sense of to move the herbivore away by creating a crappy tasting leaf, but it's really because these cells react in this way and these cells react in that way, and when all these cells are reacting and so is, the emergence is this action that takes place. We're splitting hairs, but I understand why they do it. Martyr also establishes the concept of plant intentionality by linking intentionality and growth. Growth, as referenced earlier, serves as the plant's manifestation of intentionality, a concept that undergirds a sense of the being in the world as it orients action towards and infuses existence being with some purpose or goal. That these vegetal growth-related actions may take days, weeks, or years to occur, as opposed to the more familiar temporal scale of animals or humans, does not diminish their existence as active and, importantly, proactive responses to information, and therefore with a processing that exhibits intentional behavior. And again, this is another great example of very being careful about some of these wordings in order to ensure that we're moving things forward, but we're not stating things that science can't prove right now, because they still have to be inside of that. They have to be able to argue these facts, which is, slightly different again from, and that was another concept that I wanted to say, is that we as plant communicators can say, the plant told me. Chihuahuas can't say that. Like, they can't just say, this response came. This is I think I talked about this when I did Nathaniel Meyer's paper on plant sensing, where she was saying how, a lot of the younger scientists were running into problems where they can't just say that this intuition came from the plant, but ultimately the intuition came from the plant. So we can say it here in NCC as Sprouts. We can say this all the time, but not everybody can. So that's why we're going to see these mincing of words. But what if intentionally performing, in the sense of replicating some behaviors for display or communication for the benefit of an audience? Do we see evidence that plants are undertaking outwardly directed performances? Have you seen how plants modify themselves for pollination? In order to discuss this concept, we must turn back to plant behavior to further clarify the nature of plant behavior as phenotypic plasticity. Plant behavior as form. In a germinal text written at mid-century, Agnes Arber sought to reconsider the form of plants under an integrated and simultaneously older sense of the term that fused both form and function, and therefore more clearly explained the concept of plant behavior. The morphology of plants, Arber argued, must be understood to comprise not only their external visual appearance, but also their internal structures and molecular actions. Moreover, among plants, Arber writes, form may be held to include something corresponding to behavior in the zoological field. The animal can do things without inducing any essential change in its bodily structure. When a bird uses its beak to pick up food, the beak remains unchanged. But for most, though, not for all plants, The only available forms of action are either growth or discarding of parts, both of which involve a change in the size and form of the organism. I would even say, well, the form, I guess that's what they were saying. Yes, and this is, I think, a really interesting conversation piece that many of us have grapple with, in the sense that I don't ever want for us to simply talk about growth relating to plants, as if everything that they do is towards growth. Like that's the reason why they did it, is for growth. But what we forget is that where we as human beings, like I'm moving my arms and therefore I can grab my arm and pick up this mug and I can drink my tea and now this. If a plant wanted to pick up that mug, what does a plant have to do? Let's just say the intentionality is there. Plant, pick up mug. What does the plant do? The plant has to start growing some part of themselves, right? I look up at, Diplania up above me, who is growing out all these stems, one of which just touched Noel, the Christmas cactus. And I told you not to do that. So I have to fix that. I asked you nicely not to do that. Anyway, the point being is like a stem has to be grown out to then somehow grow around the mug. And then as the plant continues to grow upwards, will lift the mug. And then if the plant chooses to have that mug move closer, which again, remember, intentionality, because they're not plant communicators, they can't get into the mind of plants saying, are you doing this because you know what you're doing? They don't know that, right? So, but let's assume that then the plant wanted to bring the mug closer. The plant then has to start to decay a part of that growth in order or move the growth in another direction. You see how then growth is analogous to our movement in general. This is a concept that's a little hard to understand. I don't think most of us have realized that when we talk about plant growth in that way, as intentionality, we're talking about it from that perspective, because plants don't have natural body parts that have that level of flexibility in them. They could move a leaf, but usually if the leaf needs to reach out to a different area to touch, kind of like up above here where you're touching Noel, the plant has to grow that stem out. And that is the equivalent of us standing up and walking over to it. So I say this because I really think it moves and shifts the way we perceive things. A bit later, Arber clarifies this notion of morphological behavior. This sequence of growth stages entailing shape transformations corresponds to a whole series of motor acts in an animal. It's what I just said. And also to such directive activities as those concerned in sexual reproduction, assembling a store of food, and going into hibernation for the dead season. All of those things plants do by growing and decaying different parts of their body. Plants, that is, behave by growing or shedding elements of themselves. I feel like every time I say something right afterwards, it's right there. And in doing so, permanently alter their phenotypic structures. In this way, many plants' behaviors are not simply something that plants do, but are simultaneously the means whereby plants materialize themselves into existence. This is a beautiful line. I really, 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 really like this line. The form of plant structure is a function of plant behavior, which renders phenotypic plasticity the embodied grammar of plant behavior. I love that line too. This is so great. Jill in the comments says to ask an elemental friend to do the action. I think in some cases that is possible, but there are many cases where even the elemental friend can't do it, because the elemental friend doesn't have a form in the world, a form that necessarily can do that kind of action. So I think that it's really, and you know what? Sometimes you don't want to ask somebody else to do it. You want to do it yourself. So I think that you're right. I think that there is much more collaboration that we see, and we see this from a scientific perspective. We see this with herbivores and like plants that attract, for example, certain kinds of wasps to help with other kinds of situations. And that is a form of behavior. It's like us going, psst, come over here. The plant releases a certain volatile organic compound that then that other animal, receives, there's a receptor for, and then that animal comes over and does something on behalf of the plant. And I do believe that that's the equivalent of, come over here and help me with that. So I do believe that that probably happens with more than human beings on every level, including the subtle planes. When kin can't do that, can resort to growing their own body. Or maybe when they don't want to, they want to do it yourselves. When this notion of plant behavior as form established, we can now, with this notion of plant behavior as form established, we can now understand a curious dimension of plant growth as a form of behavior, modularity. As Halle notes, many plants, seed plants as well as clonal and rhizomatic plants, grow via a kind of reiterative architectural process that is understood to be modular. This means that the plants can be understood to have a fairly uniform pattern of morphogenic growth that is repeated by sequentially grown elements of the plant, beginning with an initial seedling that displays a tendency to develop leaves and then branches, for example. Many plants will go on to develop branches which themselves have a tendency to develop leaves and then branch. This pattern of embodied behavior is called a module. And these modules combine to form an architectural model that is reiterated into a form we refer to as a plant. Considering the example of a fairly large tree, such as a maple, it is the easiest way to understand this principle in practice. The familiar forms of the maples that dot many suburban front yards are a study in modularity. They possess, is this like a Canadian paper? Is that why you're used to seeing maples all over the place, or something farther up north? They possess a thick singular trunk which branches into smaller trunks and a few feet above the ground, which then go on to branch into branches. These trunks and branches were all, at one point, small branches that grew leaves and then were repurposed into support structures for further branching and leafing out. Through the process of repetition and reiteration, the logic of plant modularity produces a given tree. While relatively few plants are absolutely modular insofar as they are exact morphological replications of their original modular form, the vast majority of plants do display this modular form in their processes of growth and development. The phenotypic reiterated shape taken by a single plant is as much dependent on its ontogenetic and modular processes as it is on the environment in which it finds itself. As plants grow towards light sources, wind their way around fences and posts, are pruned by herbivores and weather events, grow to consume objects and bend in responses to stiff breezes, their modular growth patterns alter in response to the environmental conditions. Which makes sense, right? We as humans do the exact same thing, right? We can be born in an environment that seems to be the same, but slight differences in the way what we have around us will create, or, whenever we get hurt, or when, it will change slightly the way, not as extreme as it is because plants can't run away, where we as humans will run away. So we have more of our sort of imprinted blueprint, more exposed, you can say, where a plant has to constantly be modifying. But really, we all do. I mean, this is why we see certain swaths of the population that have certain characteristics that match their environment, light hair and light eyes and all these different aspects. Where am I? As a plant read that. They are, in technical terms, indeterminate in bodily form. If Arbor's line of reasoning is applied to this reality, it becomes apparent that the modularity of plants, each module, is a behavioral act, a simultaneously formal and functional intentional gesture by the plants. That these behaviors are replicated, reiterated again and again by plants, shifted and restored through each performance of growth, adapted to environmental conditions such as availability of light and interactions with neighbors, conspecifics and predators, allows us to finally acknowledge the material performativity of plants that confronts us each time we view them. The material form we call plants are, in reality, the embodied traces of restored behavioral performances. Plants meet the Schichnerian rubric of twice behaved behavior, countless times in the process of undertaking their embodied and material lives, and leave traces of these performances on display for us to witness each time we look down at plants around our feet or gaze up to the branches of a tree swaying in the breeze. This is really interesting, especially because in the Seattle Sculpture Park, if anybody has ever gone to this, it's beautiful. And many years ago, when I went, I was completely enthralled. This is before my plant reawakening, but I was completely enthralled with one of the sculptures, which now, using these definitions, make me realize that this wasn't a sculpture as much as a performance. It's a performance piece where a downed tree was on display for us to be able to see how that downed tree, through the years of how the tree kind of completely transforms over time, how some parts of the tree decay, how some parts of the tree actually stay alive, all the different other plants and animals and that are being nourished by this tree. So ferns that are popping up and mushrooms that are coming up, how the decomposers start to step in, where do the ants go and what do they do? All of this is on display in this beautiful kind of room that was created for us to be able to see the plant in quote unquote a natural environment, while the plant is basically outdoors, but within this glass. Like the glass separates us from the tree, but the tree is actually exposed to the elements, so that you can see this constant performance that the plant is playing out through the decay process. And it's beautiful. It's so powerful of a performance piece of like the life of this tree in the tree's death process. It's so worth seeing, so amazing. And I feel like that's what we're talking about here. Audience analysis, plants as performers. The missing piece of the performance puzzle in this argument is the consideration of whether plants intentionally undertake material behavioral restorations to express some condition or to offer message content to an audience. Does the aforementioned repertoire of morpho-behavioral performance communicate? It's a good question. I think that's why they called that a sculpture rather than a performance, because is the performance would imply that you do something for the audience. But is that always true? Is that always true? I guess you're trying to convey a message to the audience in every performance piece. In order to fully examine this question, it is important to first clarify the semiotic quality of plant communication, particularly as they manifest in the non-dualistic representational system developed by Charles Peirce and as updated by anthropologist Eduardo Kohn. Peirce, by way of Kohn, offers a mode of representational living that clarifies the question of plant communication and intentionality. There's clarity? I'm curious now. The semiotic system of relations articulated by Peirce is famous for its multiple and varied definitions of the variety of sign known as symbol, which operates via a conventionalized cultural association between the signifier and the signified. However, Peirce also establishes the existence of simpler classifications of signs, namely icons, embodying likeness and physical resemblance between the signifier and the signified, and indices, evidentiary links between the signifier and the signified. While plants cannot engage in abstracted, culturally conventionalized symbolic representations, they do engage in both iconic and indexical representations. Okay, now I'm curious. The outcomes of which are similar to outcomes of symbolic communication. As Kohn has pointed out, the specific organizations shape capacities for movement and flexibility, and other characteristics of living organisms serve as embodied sign vehicles, insofar as there are manifestations of processes of evolutionary success. At bare minimum, the phenotype of a living organism represents the characteristics of an environment that are relevant to that organism, as well as the outcomes of relationships with other organisms. If, as Arber claims, the phenotype of a plant is reflective of a plant's behavioral interaction with its environment and vegetal, animal, and human peers, The success of that phenotype in representing that relational environment iconically and indexically will link morphobehavioral success in responding and representing an environment to success in procreation via communication. There are a lot of really huge words in that sentence. So give me a second. I want to read it again. If, as Arbor claims, the phenotype of a plant, so the change in morphology of a plant, is reflective of a plant's behavioral interaction with its environment and vegetal, animal, and human peers. Okay, so if the way a plant changes morphology, not necessarily morphology, but changes some aspect of key self, in response to or as a part of an interaction with the environment and with other beings in that environment, the success of that phenotype in representing that relational environment iconically, because that's the change, and indexically, because indexically, remind me again, all right, we're going back to the define, evidentiarily linked between, yes, because you can see that that is linked, okay, will link morphobehavioral success to success in procreation via communication. Is it just procreation then? Let's just go with it. Let's go that it's just with procreation. But I agree with the sentence. Okay, that makes sense now. The etymological roots of the term communication, the Latin verb comunicare, meaning to share or to make common, serves to bolster the notion that performance is inextricable from efforts at messaging in service of a shared experience, a dialogic communication. This dialogic model is not, however, the only model of communication. As Peters points out, dissemination, monologic communication, is a viable model of communication, insofar as communication may entail the transmission of information that is invariant and open, addressed to whom it may concern, and consequently uncertain with regards to its potential audience. Plants, that is, may signal widely, and the absence of a tightly coupled, co-present audience at any given moment does not diminish their ongoing capacity to represent via morphobehavioral manifestations. As Goyer notes, while it is useful to acknowledge that communication, thus defined, is not restricted to humans, it does introduce a distinguish between direct sharing of experience and vicarious sharing of experiences. It can be argued that direct sharing of experience may occur when any living organism interacts with another living organism at the most elementary biochemical level. The vicarious, indirect, or mediated sharing of experiences, however, by definition, only occur through the sharing of symbols and signs and symbols. Yeah, but I think we're still not getting to, I mean, in that performance, it sounds like what I'm hearing is it's performance, because if you were to imagine the plants are communicating what it is that is happening, and they're communicating with the other beings in which it's happening. I don't have any doubt that between the quote unquote actors, there is the equivalent of what could be intentionality and therefore performance happening. I also believe that plants literally put on a show for other beings, not just reactively, but also proactively. I really do believe that. I think the harder part is when you think of an audience that is is there an intentional audience is the question I'm asking myself through this. In the sense that when I think about a performance, but maybe this is incorrect, I think about a performance as something I create for the benefit of the audience member that is going to be consuming that. When a plant does all these things that are happening, there is no doubt that there is an intentionality between the actors. Or maybe what they're saying is really what I'm defining as two actors interacting is really one actor and one audience member who happens to get an experience from it. That's a little bit harder out there, but I can see that. And yet Cohn's formulation of life as a sign process does suggest that living creatures existing biosemiotically vicariously transmit their experiences through the mediating factors of time and filiation. As Cohn puts it, This body, with its adaptation, functions as a new sign representing those features of the environment insofar as it, in turn, will be interpreted as such by a subsequent generation in the eventual construction of that generation's body. Because lineages of organisms whose features less accurately capture relevant environmental features do not survive as well, the lineage that do persist come to exhibit comparatively increasing fittedness to this environment. They are most exhaustive representations of it. I get all this, but I'm still losing the performance piece of it. Maybe that he's going to tie it back together. Life itself reflects the aboutness of intentionality. I guess maybe he's just trying to prove intentionality, and I'm already with him. I'm already with him on intentionality. Insofar as the forms, matters, lifestyles, and continuation of living organisms are iconic and indexical representations of the world, the active morpho-behavioral representations of vegetal lives are about their world and their lives, and consequently reflect the conflation of the process of living and the representations of that life. For sake of easy comparison between more traditional definitions of performance and this radically divergent account, it is worth stepping back into the familiar definitional terrain of performance as a communicative act which happens for the audience. This is the part I'm having a problem with. For an audience. Performance is a communicative process. All in agreement there. All performances are transaction communication events between speakers and listeners. With you. We know that plants go to great lengths to send a specific signal to certain parties and attempt to exclude others. There are intended receivers, audiences, for plant signaling, a signal that we have already established as an inextricable from twice behaved morpho-behavioral growth or diminution. Okay, I get it. I think I get it now what they're trying. Okay, let me read this all and then I'll sum it up. About the particular life and experience. The most obvious case wherein plants are attempting to advertise their changeable status to others is the case of flowers, which are simultaneously reproductive organs and garish attractants display for pollinators. I used that example earlier. Plants display their module logics of embodied performance in their flowers through a whole host of strategies undertaken to catch a pollinator's attention. You know what I think we're getting to here is that my definition of performance is kind of more in the obviously secular world of somebody who has no idea about the performance arts from the perspective of learned scholar, but who just thinks about performance as in like, I went to a concert, I went to a theater, I went to a performance piece, I went to a museum, I went to something else. But in reality, all the life's a stage. And therefore, anytime we do something for the benefit of some external thing to ourselves, whether that's me standing at a bar, I wouldn't do that. I would go to the bar if there's concert and really great music and some really cool friends. But anyways, when somebody like, goes and tries to attract the attention of somebody, or whether I'm giving a presentation, in some ways, it's a form of performance. And therefore, I'm performing for an audience. And in that aspect, plants, by interacting with their environment in intentional ways that want to elicit some kind of reaction, that is a performance. I think that's where he's really trying to go to. Many flowers that appear solidly colored to the human eye, fluorescence in the UV spectrums perceptible to insect eyes, with garish patterns or bullseye spots that direct the pollinator towards the pollen-bearing reproductive organs of the flower. If the morpho-behavioral argument is applied to this process, it becomes apparent that the modular flowering of a plant with an obvious entreaty to its desired pollinator partner is the vegetal equivalent of a performed come hither. In a further analogy between these insect audiences and the audiences of the performance, I think it appears that insects essentially learn how to interpret visual floral signals, beginning as naive attendants with no preferences and gradually developing interpretive abilities that lead them towards preferring certain flowers and varieties of patterns and others over others. Floral markings, that is, function indexically for pollinators, alerting them to the presence of nectar and pollen by way of a particular sign. All of this makes perfect sense. I think that but it implies that plants as actors, at least this is what I'm hearing, but maybe I'm just reading it wrong. So I look forward to your feedback on this. Do all plant actors have to only play along with other actors? Do the plants ever play or perform for a distant audience that does not interact with that plant? But I get, because that is not necessarily just from a functional perspective. That's the question. Because plants obviously signal, even for distance, that to other plants that maybe have to react in some way as a form of communication. There is no doubt to me that plants communicate in a wide variety of ways. And I do think that they perform for other actors. It's still not clear to me how they perform. How do they perform for an actual intended audience that is supposed to have their own experience? That's not just simple, I'm communicating to you, but maybe all communication isn't my mind's about to explode. I'm just going to keep reading. Some plants take the logic of visually appealing to insects even further by iconically representing the formal traits of the insect that pollinates them. In an example of ontological slippage via morphobehavior made famous by Deleuze and Guattari, a number of orchid species have become wasp mimics, subtly shifting their floral physiognomy to resemble the shape and color of potential hymenopteran mate. You take that. Iconography in plant communication is not limited to sight. Some orchids produce volatile chemicals that recreate the pheromone secretions of their targeted pollinator. This mimicry in morpho-behavioral logic of plants is an embodied mimemic action, assertive verisimilitude rooted in precise replication that renders the plant wasp-like, regardless of its phenotype shape. The resemblance that defines an iconic sign need not be a visual resemblance, but is instead the production of a chemical substance. I mean, that structure that is identical to the chemical produced by wasps, which I mentioned earlier. This iconic mimicry goes on to form the basis of an embodied intimacy between plant and pollinator that exceeds simple reproductive instrumentation, as Hustak and Myers writes, and is instead a process of delicate caress, a chemical communication. This communication, a performance of impersonation in Babcock's terms, or straight personation in Talcock, complicates the relationship between morphobehavior and embodied performance in novel ways, particularly with regard to performer agency and the relatively effectiveness of impersonation over interpretation for certain aesthetics. Hold on a second. Sorry, I was just asked for something. Oh, sorry. Somebody's asking me for something that they need. How do I do this? I'm trying to see if I can forward this to somebody. Oh, wow. This is a really bad interface. Sorry. I just got asked to do something in a really bad interface. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Finally, we might look to the example of mutualistic relationship between tropical pitcher plants and certain insectivore bats as evidence of the plant's morphobehavioral structure, actively communicating via an iconic. Okay, hold on. I'm forwarding through some of these because I completely understand what Brisini is trying to get to, relating to the idea that, again, relationship to a certain extent between two actors. And it is a form of a performance. I can totally see that, right? These plants, while seemingly passively redirecting sound, are communicating their status as clearly as on Neon's side at Roadside Motel. vacancy, room available. If a bat already occupies the pitcher, its body blocks the sound reflection from the pitcher and therefore serves as a kind of no vacancy sign. Without any doubt, plants are communicating in all of these methods. My question, though, is on performance. There's still a little nagging piece to me. The conclusion of this revelation regarding the semiotic lives of plants is not that we, humans, and plants as actors are identical. We're clearly not. Agreed with that. But we do share a variety of fundamentally similar communicative strategies and undertake these communications between ourselves, our communities, and our worlds in markedly similar ways. The semiotics of life, embodied and, dare I say, performed, are a unifying feature, a point of commonality between theories of human performance and theories of phytomorphic performance. As Cohn notes, a continuity exists between human and non-human modes of representation, and we can recognize this without losing sight of the distinctive characteristics that different semiotic modalities have. Articulate. My neighbor has decided right now that he wants to build something on his terrace. So I'm hearing hammering. All right. Articulating a plant performance does not diminish our human performances, but rather acknowledges that our complex symbolic human performances rests upon and are made possible by semiotic processes present in non-human context as well. And I guess this is the question, right? I'm glad that he wrote this, because this makes sense to me. It's kind of like saying these are the origins of performance, which happened in this way, and then we went out and created symbolic human performances. And in some ways, even plants do perform symbolic types of performances, because some of the impersonation that they do is sometimes symbolic. It's devoid of other aspects that complete a process, right? They're like, they imitate other kinds of beings, and for different purposes. And not all of it is just procreation, although a majority has been linked to procreation. But I think that's just because we as humans don't see their performance of play. For example, Stefano Mancuso talks about plants in their younger, as young sprouts, playing. And this is a form of performance that happens strictly for the entertainment value and the stretching out and working with your body, very similar to what we see in young animals, and the way that like small cubs play and stuff, and the like. So I do think that there are more symbolic vegetal performances now that I think about it. I just think that we as humans are not necessarily ready to recognize those, to see them. These phytomorphic performances are evidence of that the utility of performance is for providing a way to constitute meaning and affirm individual and cultural values, is not limited only to an appraisal of bracketed off culture, but can also serve as potent conceptual tools for understanding the muddiness of the so-called divide between culture and nature. This contiguous, non-dualistic conceptual space goes by a variety of names, the most prominent of which is nature culture. Plant performance is not simply a proxy for human performance in a different kind of kingdom of life, but rather, not simply a proxy for human performance, but rather is evidence that the logic of action, restoration of behavior, and communicative exchange we dub performance is an important compound of understanding the outcomes of multi-species interactions and engagement that get summed up as life itself. Now there we go. I think we just got to the heart of the matter. So, phytomorphizing performance. Plants are active communicators, intentional actors, and, by even a fairly strict rubric of evaluation, capable performers. They perform through specialized alterations in their phenotype, making use of the modular logics of growth, shedding, and death in order to achieve intentional behavioral and repetitive ends. As I've described in the course of this essay, these performances are analogous, if not identical, to the highly motile and active behaviors of animals and persons. And most importantly, they do so in the company of other actors as active participants in the pantheon of performers whose actions, interactions, and intra-actions alike are among the foundational worlding gestures of our living planet. Oh, hold on. Sorry. Excuse me, somebody is there. They kind of need me to do this thing. And right now I'm like, mandati che? Okay. Ugh. Okay, sorry. It's like asking. I'm suggesting that plant performance is intimately tied to plant growth and death. I'm suggesting that performance is should be understood as one of the foundational mechanisms whereby Earth came to be and continue. Okay, I don't. Sorry. This is really frustrating me because I have this like person who needs me to do something, and I'm no so. All right. Sorry, they're just asking me a bunch of questions about something relating to a business thing that needs to be done because today is Friday. But of course, they waited until the end, 6 o'clock on Friday in order to get it done. So I'm trying to desperately do this and it's not working. Sorry. Like, this material performance is the substrate whereby the lives that we lead, already thoroughly conceptualized as performance by performance studies theorists, are enabled. It is the case of material performance making possible and enriching for the performance, not necessarily teleologically, but virtually as a condition of possibility. If we understand the concept of phytomorphism to be, as I've claimed, an acknowledgement of plant performance, then an effort at attempting to phytomorphize performance would mean drawing some insight about performance via the performances of plants. One element of doing so requires a thinking of temporal dimension of performance. What do we make of performance that might take a century to unfold, as in the case of the flowering of the bromeliad Puya Raimondi? Beyond this consideration, which is the equivalent of what I was talking about relating to the law, like to the tree that is down and is now transforming. Beyond this consideration, there are also unanswered questions about the concept of material performances, particularly with regard to the question of performance ontology as one of ephemerality or disappearance. When Phelan contends that performance operates ontologically by vanishing, it becomes itself through disappearance. She is suggesting that performance somehow fully manifests its ontology through its refusal to linger. And yet, the materialist performances of plants that I have established in this essay do precisely that. They linger on, materialized in the act of being performed, for timeframes that boggle the imagination. There is a great basin bristled pine, Pinus longeva, currently living via the embodied traces of performance across 5 millennia, and even more. If the morphobehavioral logic of replicated behavior is extended, as it should be, to the genetically inflected behavioral manifestations of clonal organisms, the quaking aspen, named Pando, has been durationally performing for 80,000 years. Their material substrates are traces that persist and enable future performances, and in doing so may reveal a kind of persistence of the past in all performances, and in doing so may reveal a kind of notion of the duration of performance beyond even established durational performance timescales. The reality of plant performance also has implications for more traditional FAIR and performance studies scholarship. Attending to vegetal dimensions of our aesthetic productions means turning towards plants as active co-performers, and consequently as entities whose contribution to the physical production of work may be marked as paper, as wood, as shade, as substance for performing bodies. We might turn to the presence of plants that we overlook in our performed literature, a form of plant blindness, and highlight those dimensions in terms of plants and plant performances described. How Oh no. How might we reconsider or restage Frost's frame narrator, the swinger of birches, when it is to the birches themselves that we turn for an account of their lives and woodlot communions? Ethnographic fieldwork becomes precisely that, fieldwork, if we acknowledge that ethnos, typically defined as race, nation, or people, is more precisely associated with acknowledging a foreign people, naming outsiders. Plants are, in ways described in this essay, vastly foreign to our human lives, and perhaps demand non-human performance ethnographies and their own, wherein we attend to these foreigners among us. Autoethnography, the writing of one's own culture, might be conceived along the same lines. As the writing of the foreigners, the human and non-human, biological and mineralogical others that make up one's nature culture. This would be to make use of the word ethnos, as Homer does, to mean a multitude, whether of humans or beasts, associated or us living together. A company, a troop, a swarm. In recognizing human and non-human others as fellow agents and narrative subjects, we make possible ethical, collaborative, communicative, and mutualistic projects. You listening to that, spider plant? They're finally getting it. They're finally realizing that you are part of it. Finally, there is a need to answer a question posed by Longyear about the wicked problem of the environmental turn in performance studies. How does performance figure into an evaluatory, positive, and embodied role in the task of earthly betterment? My sense is that the promise of performance to achieve these goals is not aided by the use of performance to simplify narratives or facts for easy consumption, but via precisely the opposite maneuver, making the seemingly simple stories of entities, like plants, into arresting, active, and compelling accounts of co-performance. Think down tree. We achieve this goal, in short, by using the framing conceit of performance as, and the embodied practice of performance is, as means of reenacting the world, reanimating what has been stripped of its agency by humanism, Cartesianism, and Western scientism. This reenchantment, a rebirth of wonder perhaps, in Ferlinghetti's term, must come from beyond the consideration of fair market value, beyond the projection of crop yields, beyond some analysis of the year-end growth in population or housing or GDP. Instead, it must come from the making wonderful of the world, the revelation of something as simple as a roadside wild plant, as a fellow performer, every tree and flower and leaf of grass, a performance. Phytomorphizing performance hints at a whole constellation of altered performances among divergent agencies and in plants, animal, fungal, and microbial worlds of interrelation. Performance is one mode of traveling down this path towards reenchanted world. If, as Jane Bennett contends, enchantment can foster an ethically laudable generosity of spirit and the cultivation of an eye for the wonderful becomes something like an academic duty, we in performance studies as well are well situated to answer this duty-bound call. We are prepared not only to look for the wonderful, but to find ourselves caught up in it, bound up and rooted. The wild plants and you and me, co-performance in the unfolding worlding together. That was a really good ending. Very performance-like. Very, very performance-like. Like, now this really has expanded my concept of performance. Like, and really gives birth to the idea of all the world's a stage. I mean, seriously gives a lot of consideration into all the world's a stage. I mean, ultimately, isn't that where we're getting to? All the world's a stage. So I'm blurry again. I really, really, really enjoy this. So I really love the idea of just looking at performance through a different lens and therefore including the more than human and the other kin into these performance type spaces. And I think that this will, kind of like I was talking about earlier about how people like Martyr and Trovalis need to move through a whole series of steps before they can really ascertain consciousness, like consciousness in a direct way. We need to give ourselves the space to first view the plant's performance as us audience members, to then move deeper into it and eventually be able to be co-actors. I think this already happens a little bit more in the arts, like not performance, but it happens in other parts of art, where I think that there is a lot more interspecies co-creation. We see this with co-writing. We see this as co-art creation, where there is a vegetal communication happening, and like we act as the arms for what is happening in the plant. I think that that's a space that's already much more open. I think the performance space is one that is still relatively closed. I've only seen a few actors, human actors, in that world. And I think something like this is really going to help continue to push that limit. So I'm really interested in all of your thoughts about this. This was a lot. I mean, we went through a lot over the 2 times that we met. Yeah, exactly. As Jill put it, key is kin are really working to get our attention, to play with this wonder, to move us through this space, and to become, again, co-actors first and foremost, instead of right now, which is a spectator and, vegetal, natural world performing out. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what the space is. All right, that's it for me. This was amazing, as always. Thank you so much for your presence. Again, leave me a comment. Let me know your thoughts. I'm really excited about continuing forward. I've got some really great papers coming forward. I mean, we've now hit the good times, 2019, 2020, all the way to 2024. There's just so much more research coming out, and I really am looking forward to sharing all this with you. So that's me, Tigre Gardenia. Remember, resist the urge to hold back your evolving brilliance, and anything you need, you know where to find me. I'm out. Bye.